our Master of Ceremonies, Dr. John. Okay, before we get going on our next presentation, I just want to give a special welcome to one of our audience members here today who really pioneered a lot of the study of Virginia and the backcountry and the French and Indian War and beyond from an early standpoint. His career that's spanned over many years. Warren Hofstra is with us today, a very admired person in the field of scholars. I hate to embarrass him, so I won't ask him to raise
John.
I won't ask him to raise his hand, but he just shouted out, so now you know who he is. So thanks for being with us today. Okay, our next speaker is Scott Patchan. He is a graduate of James Madison University and author of 8 books, including his most recent, George Washington in the French and Indian War. Scott is a regular leader of historical programs in the American Civil War, French and Indian War, Revolutionary War. He's also involved in battlefield preservation and interpretation with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation. If you've ever come to a Civil War program with the foundation, Scott has been either a tour guide or speaker or both. Very knowledgeable, so we're glad to have him with us to talk about the French and Indian War this time. Scott?
It was said of Washington in 1754 that is this better? It was said of the Washington in 1754 that a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world afire. And while the exact attribution of that line is under debate, uncertainty, the basic literal factualness of it is quite accurate. Washington's actions in what's now western Pennsylvania would ignite what became a global conflict, the 7 Years' War. John had explained to you how there had been several French and Indian wars before here, but most of those wars had initiated over in Europe, and the conflict had carried over to the colonies here, following line with the respective mother countries. But in 1754, the flames that erupted started over the settlement and control of the Ohio country. Now, at this point in time, when that previous war ended in 1748, the same year that the war ended, the British have formed what was known as the Ohio Company, which was to settle that area out in what's now southwest Pennsylvania. The Ohio country in general was the Allegheny River all the way down the Ohio River and all the tributaries that flowed around it. And the Ohio Company was tasked with putting settlers on that ground and building forts. And they were allotted a certain segment, which is now in southwestern Pennsylvania. It includes Pittsburgh, which was known at the time as the Forks of the Ohio. And they had to put settlers on there in order to maintain their royal charter that they had been granted. There were influential men of Virginia, including the Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Washington's 2 older brothers were amongst the men who had stakes in the Ohio Company. So things begin to get dicey here as the British start moving into this region known as the Ohio country. Both sides believe that previous treaties with each other in which some of the native peoples gave them title to these lands. In truth, it was neither clear. But the British initially make their efforts out there in western Pennsylvania, Ohio, which is now West Virginia and parts of western Maryland, as traders. And they're bringing high quality goods, trading with the Indians. The French are getting concerned because the Indians are liking the goods they're getting from the English. So the French are going to begin kind of pushing back on their own. Initially, they will have an expedition by an officer named Celeron, and he will plant half a dozen lead plates in the ground at important tributaries along the Ohio River, from north of Pittsburgh all the way out to what's now the area around Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, didn't really mean much. A lot of the tribes along the way essentially laughed at the French and at their efforts. When they ordered English traders away, they refused to go in most cases. But anyway, it was an old European custom that the French were attempting to stake their claim to this ground in the Ohio country. Now, in 1752, they would lash back. The British had established a trading post in Pickawillinie, where the Miami Indian tribe was. It's deep into what's now southwestern Ohio, and they would raid it. And they would hit this village while most of the warriors were out hunting, and they'd have an easy time. In the process, they would kill an elderly chief, boiling him and eating him, and as well as killing a British trader. The rest of the British were hauled off as prisoners to Fort Detroit. So the tensions in 1752 are already ratcheting up. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia is working on a treaty with the Native Americans out in the Ohio country around Pittsburgh, in what becomes known as the Treaty of Logstown, which was kind of interesting because the treaty is essentially going to be between an Iroquois chief known as the Half King. His official name is Tanagreeson. I'll be referring to him quite frequently today, but he is from the Iroquois nation up in New York. The Iroquois, by right of conquest, control all this land. However, most of the occupants of this land are Shawnees and Delawares, and they only grudgingly give as little respect to the Half King as they feel they have to, and he does not necessarily speak for them. This man, the Half King, is going to be instrumental. He's very anti-French in his perspective, and he is going to soon become Washington's lone Indian ally as the actions unfold. French by 1753 are going to be moving into northwest Pennsylvania up here. We're focusing on this area up here. They're initially going to sail down through Lake Erie and basically along the shores in their canoes and bateaux, and they will establish Fort Presque Isle, which is at modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania. They'll move out about 7 miles south of there and build Fort LeBoeuf. And then south of there, they will occupy a British trading post that they'll seize, and that will be at what's now known as Venango, Pennsylvania. So the French, in early spring of 1753, are moving southward into the Ohio country. While the British had made economic overtures there, the French are moving forward in military force. Boots on the ground, so to speak. Now, one of the problems that the English have is that a lot of the Indians, although they were disposed to trade with the English, they had watched what had happened to the Miamis and how they were unable to respond to the French efforts because, frankly, the English weren't able to support any of these tribes militarily. Here's Pickawillinie out here in western Ohio. You can see how deep it is. So now the governor of Virginia, the lieutenant governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, this is his picture right here, he's going to turn to a young Virginian, general who later became General George Washington of the Continental Army and our first president of the United States. This is a picture, those of you who were on the walking tour yesterday saw this statue of supposed to be young Washington in the late 1740s as a surveyor here and out around the Shenandoah Valley and much of this Ohio company. But Washington has come from a relatively prominent family, connected to the Ohio Company, connected to Robert Dinwiddie. Washington in 1754 is going to be 22 years old. He was one of the younger sons of his father. His father would die when he was only 10 years old, and his two older brothers, who had had benefit of being sent to London for their education, would essentially be the men that he would look up to, most especially his brother Lawrence. His brother Lawrence, though, becomes deathly ill and is dying in early 1752. Doctors say the only thing that can save him is to go spend some time in the Caribbean. Young Washington accompanies his brother there, but they see that it's failing, and Washington will take the ships back to Virginia. He will disembark kind of somewhat prophetically at Yorktown and then travel to Williamsburg to deliver some messages to Governor Dinwiddie there. And this is going to be the first encounter that he would have. Now, young Washington, and this is 1752. He's a tall, strong, handsome, well-spoken gentleman of Virginia. And one of the things that Washington, as a young man in his writings, he always wants to do things proper, in the proper way. He wants to be perceived as a gentleman of the finest British society. And he will, by the 1753, his brother would pass away in the summer of 1752. And Washington will receive an appointment as the adjutancy of one of the districts of the Virginia militia. It's a start in the military career that Washington had wanted, but it's not as much of a military job as it would seem. But it does give Washington the rank of major, and when 1753 rolls around and the French are moving into northwest Pennsylvania, Dinwiddie is going to turn to young Washington to carry a message to those dastardly French who have dared to step foot onto King George II's lands in the Virginia colony, what was part of the Virginia colony. It was actually disputed between Virginia and Pennsylvania at that point, as well as between the French and the English. So Washington will leave at the end of October, travel up to the area around Pittsburgh, and there for the first time he'll become acquainted with the Half-King. And he's supposed to make some Indian allies to accompany him there and to get some guards to serve him and the small party that had accompanied Washington north to the forts. And Washington learns very quickly that the Native Americans have their own time frame. Washington's quite eager to move immediately and get to the French forts and deliver his message. Not only does he want to deliver his message, he's going to take intricate notes on the French dispositions, the size of the garrisons, and take this back. So he's going to be taking a dual mission there. He's going to be serving as a spy as well as a diplomat. Of course, when he arrives at the fort where he meets the French commander, he is going to be very much impressed with him and refers to him as holding quite the air of a soldier. And the man had been there, had indeed been involved in much of the French military actions. One of the things I want to just talk about now here is that the French military there, they were marine companies, Frances de la Marine, and they were outfitted, bolstered by the milice, the French militia. I look at trying to visualize some of these French milice as probably if you're a connoisseur of movies from the 40s and 50s, and you had that French trapper type character out there and stuff. But these were hardy guys that lived on the frontier. They hunted, they trapped, they traded. They had fought with Indians, they had fought against Indians. The quality of the force that the French are going to have out here is going to be superior to what George Washington will be bringing with him. Now, getting back to his mission there at the French forts, obviously the French, they're going to take the message in, and obviously that when they read that Dinwiddie is ordering them off of King George's land, they are going to politely write a message back and seal it for George Washington to carry to Dinwiddie that tells Dinwiddie no, this is our land, and you need to stay on your side of the mountains here. So we're kind of at a standoff. Now Dinwiddie, is 1753, has evolved. He's already in communications with London, and there's already ships starting to bring over some military supplies to the Virginia colony. Now, it grows as we get into early 1754, as this Dinwiddie has this refusal of the French to leave. He right away in January determines that he needs to, this picture right here is just south of Kurztown. This is the original Heights Fort. And George Washington spent some time there in the late 1740s when he first came out here to the valley as part of a survey expedition for the lands of Lord Fairfax. One of Washington's first nights out, living away from the luxury of home at Mount Vernon, which was had been his brother's estate, he would stay in a room at a tavern. And when he awoke the next morning, he found himself covered in lice and other creepy crawlies that he had picked up. And the lesson that he learned there, that from now on he would sleep around the campfire at night and never again venture into one of the Motel 6 type rooms. So in that, we've talked about the maps there. Governor Dinwiddie. Now, one of the things we have talked about Lord Dunmore's war later on today, but in many ways, what's happening in 1754 is Governor Dinwiddie's war. He's trying to urge the Virginia House of Burgesses to support him financially in late 53 and early 54. And nobody's really up for putting much money towards this, even though the king has sent out orders that, hey, we have to order these people from our lands and begin making preparations here. And Dinwiddie would also experience problems trying to raise troops. The first troops to be ordered out are going to be a Captain Trent, who's going to be ordered to take 100 men from the frontier, the Shenandoah Valley and some of the lands just to the west of here, and head out to the forks of the Ohio, Pittsburgh, what's now Point State Park, and in that vicinity, build a fort that they would call Fort Prince George. And, begin to get your foothold there before the French moved down the Allegheny River from northwest Pennsylvania to seize that site themselves. Major Washington has been sent out here to the Shenandoah Valley. He's supposed to recruit an additional 100 men from the militia. Well, the men of the militia didn't quite feel that they were up for this, and Dinwiddie is furious, but there's really nothing he could do. And so Washington would return to Alexandria and begin raising the Virginia regiment, basically the dregs of society, a lot of men who drank a lot. Washington would write in March of the year, 1754, that most of the men who have come to him are basically almost without clothes, and many of them have joined for the simple reason of having need for their basic necessities. He would end up with about 150 men by the beginning of April 1754, when he would begin his trek from Alexandria out to the Shenandoah Valley. He would cross it seems weird today to think about the countryside and the woods of Fairfax County and Loudoun County, crossing the Blue Ridge at Vestal's Gap and the Shenandoah River at Vestal's Ferry, before he gets to Winchester about the middle of the month of April. Now, while he's heading out there, Trent, who had likewise had problems recruiting his 100 men and only ended up with about 43 men, is out there beginning to work on this fort in the vicinity of the forks of the Ohio. And Trent's getting word from Indians, friendly Indians, and from traders and trappers in the area that large force of French will be coming down the river in force very soon. So he's sending messages back to Washington, hurry up, I need your support. Well, the size of that force was at least 500 men and a number of pieces of artillery. You know, it really wouldn't matter if Washington had been there or not. But by the middle of April, a few days later, the French would descend upon the forks of the Ohio and demand the capture. Now, Washington's ally, the Half-King, would be there with his small band of Mingo Indians, and he would, you know, he would be storming and angry and telling the senior officer, because Trent was not present at this point in time, to resist, don't surrender this fort. But the senior officer realizes the hopelessness of the situation when he sees 9 pieces of artillery and hundreds of French soldiers ready to surround his half-starved 43 Virginia frontiersmen. And so after a peaceful dinner with the French, who actually offered to purchase the tools and the shovels and saws of the Virginians, which is refused, they march away. Now, George Washington is going to continue moving out. Once he hits the Winchester, by about the 19th, he's going to head directly west out to Fort Pearsall, which is a fortified settler's house in what's the vicinity of what's now Romney, West Virginia. And he's going to head up the south branch of the Potomac River Valley, cross the river at Old Town, Maryland, and then head over to the vicinity of what's now Cumberland, Maryland. That area was known as Wills Creek at the time. The name Cumberland will not be bestowed upon it until after Washington's campaign, when Fort Cumberland would be constructed later on in 1755. But one thing that was in the vicinity was this small fort or blockhouse known as Fort Ohio, that the Ohio Company had constructed as an advanced storage place for some supplies and trading goods for the Indians, you know, to promote the settlement out here and economic activity. So while he's there, Washington gets formal word that the fort has fallen and the troops falling back from there meet with Washington and inform him of the situation. And here's where I want to make sure that you understand the situation here, because I think too often we look at Washington, our first president and the victor of the Revolutionary War, and we tend to look at him here in retrospect as being the man in control of the situation. But what's important to note here is that George Washington is out here in the Shenandoah Valley leading a military expedition at the direction of Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Dinwiddie, as he had told a few days before Washington sets out, he writes to Colonel Fairfax, Washington's next-door neighbor at Mount Vernon. He said, Dinwiddie tells Fairfax, "I have the affairs of the Ohio very much at heart." And a lot of people in Virginia, they're like, yeah, you do, because you're looking out for those investors in the Ohio Company who are trying to make money after getting that area settled there, which is why a lot of the common folks did not rise to the occasion when the militia was called out, or why he had trouble raising funds with the Virginia House of Burgesses. But for George Washington, Dinwiddie had very specific orders. He tells him, you are to act on the defensive, but in case any attempts are made to obstruct the works or interrupt our settlements by any persons whatsoever, you are to restrain all such offenders. And in case of resistance, to make prisoners of or kill and destroy them. For the rest, you are to conduct yourself as circumstances of the service shall require, and to act as you shall find in the best furtherance of His Majesty's service. There's a lot of latitude in there. But if you're a young George Washington in spring of 1754, you've assessed the situation. Your comrades who had begun building a fort at the forts have been, by military force, pushed away from that command. The French have already seized trading posts in the vicinity. There's already been at least one family murdered in the Appalachians of what's now West Virginia by a French and Indian raid around this same time frame. Again, the overall macro situation here over the years since 1748 and the end of the previous war, the tensions have arisen, and the French actions and Washington's presence in what's now known as the Laurel Highlands area would be the spark that would ignite the French and Indian War. Now, on the 23rd of April, Washington, again up there at Fort Ohio, south of what's now Cumberland, Maryland, it's originally West Virginia, he gets into that point now. You know, Dinwiddie had pretty much assumed that Washington would have been recruited much quickly, and when those orders were issued, the time for a point of decision would have come when he was already at the fort with Captain Trent's men. But Washington was not. And so he's really at the point now where he has to act upon his own and make a decision. Washington understands that the French are too numerous and powerful militarily for him to go after them. He calls a council of war with his men on the 23rd of April, and he determines that they are going to set out for what was known as Redstone. And Redstone was another blockhouse that the Ohio Company had erected at the, map over here in Virginia. That is Brownsville, modern Brownsville, Pennsylvania, where Redstone Creek empties into the Monongahela, 37 miles south of where the French were now constructing their own significantly larger Fort Duquesne. And he reasons that he could kind of serve as a bridgehead with his 160 men, so that all these reinforcements that Dinwiddie is promising him, along with promises of supplies, and so far, every time Washington gets somewhere for his supplies, guess what? The supplies aren't there. And George Washington's learning hard lessons of logistics that he will remember very well when he is commander of the Continental Army there. But he will decide to head out there towards Redstone, and he's hoping there where he has his lodgment that these 700 troops from New York, 3 companies of independent regulars, 2 from New York and 1 from South Carolina, 400 North Carolinians under the command of Colonel Innes, as well as the other half of the Virginia regiment. You see, Washington, at this point in time, he is not even the commander of the Virginia regiment. He's second in command. But it just so happened that his contingent was recruited and ready to roll first, and so he gets out there. The actual commander of this mission, Colonel Fry, from Attleboro County, Virginia, is going to be trailing well behind. It's kind of ironic, young Washington had told Dinwiddie at one point that he had hoped to have only the lieutenant colonelcy so that he could learn more from an older, more experienced officer. As things unfold here, we're going to see Washington is really doing a good job, moving much more quickly and assembling his forces quicker than the older, more experienced officer, Colonel Fry. So Washington's going to head out, and he's going to arrive by the middle of May, May the 23rd, out at the Great Meadows, which is now where Fort Necessity National Battlefield is. This is a picture of Point State Park. What you can see here, this outline, this is the outline of the French fort that was there during the French and Indian War, Fort Duquesne. Those of you familiar with the area, I don't know if you can make this up here, but there's an advertisement for Iron City beer painted on the rocks overlooking here. This is where the Monongahela River and the Allegheny River come together to form the Ohio River. It is this point right here, where the forks of the Ohio, that become the focal point of Washington's mission. This is ultimately the objective that Dinwiddie has in mind for all these troops, is the capture of this position. Now, on his way out here, about the 20th, 21st of May, Washington is going to make an attempt to get out to western Fort Necessity area by the Allegheny River. He's going to learn that the rapids and the Ohio Falls there preclude any movement in that direction. So his troops are going to move overland. He's going to reestablish connections with his friend from his mission to visit the French of the previous year, Tanagreeson, or the Half-King. Again, it's important to understand that there's large settlements of Shawnee and Delaware in the vicinity that are technically beholden to the Iroquois League out of New York, and the Half-King is their de facto representative, but he just doesn't seem to carry a lot of sway with the vast numbers of men. Hence, when he comes to join forces with Washington, he has only a dozen warriors with them, a couple of them being very young warriors, probably 12 to 14 years of age. So, Washington is going to be in the vicinity out there at Great Meadows, the site of Fort Necessity. He looks at it and he thinks it's a wonderful defensive position there. He sees these two streams coming together in the lowest part of the ground there with high wooded ground surrounding the area as a wondrous entrenchment from which to base a future defense here. But while Washington's moving in this direction, he's going to send out reconnaissance forces westward towards Redstone. And the French commander at Fort Duquesne, Captain Contrecoeur, is going to get wind of the presence of Washington's force. And he's going to send out a force of his own under the command of Lieutenant Joseph Jumonville, Sir Jumonville, part of the Coulon de Villiers family. And he will be sent out with orders to deliver a message to Washington, much as Washington had done the year before, to tell these English to get off of the French lands. Well, this army, small force is out there. And of course, the Half-King, in the way that he was, he started to realize that he had some pull and could influence young Washington in his decision-making. And he reports back to Washington when this French platoon, company-sized formation, leaves Fort Duquesne. He tells Washington that the French army is out to get Mr. Washington. So Washington is in a rush to get the location of these troops. On the morning of the 27th of May, he's going to get reports that they had ransacked a local settlement there. But at the evening of the 27th of May, he's going to get word from scouts from the Half-King that the French had been located, encamped in an alcove just a few miles away. Now, Washington had already sent most of his troops away on scouting missions, so that evening, he leaves only a bare-bones defense back at the Great Meadows. He takes 40 men, including a company of the Valley Men under Captain Adam Stephen, on a midnight march through the woods, pouring rain coming down. Much of the muskets were fouled from the wetness and would be unable to be fired when an engagement would take place the next morning. They would meet here at these rocks, which today are known as Half-King's Rocks. This is where the Half-King and his small band had encamped. And now there they would come together. Both men went into battle. They joined forces, united under the concept of defeating the French. Washington sees this as an effort to further his service for Governor Dinwiddie in defeating the French in the first step in the process. The Half-King moves forward seeking vengeance. First, he believed that the French had killed his father. Second, the French had constantly disrespected the mantle of leadership that the Half-King considered was due him. So he's moving more for personal vengeance. As they move toward the French campground here, this is a portrait from the Park Service of these Indians and English soldiers moving through the woods towards the position of the concealed French in the woods. Washington views these men as conniving. Why are they hiding in the woods? They're here on a diplomatic mission. He's like, well, why are they hiding? But the fact of the matter becomes here that as he's moving to attack this force, that is, the Half-King and his second in command, so to speak, are going to take the lead in deploying the forces there. And there, Washington will basically be following commands that they're giving him. He's never seen this position. He doesn't know where the French are. So this wondrous account that Dr. David Preston had found when he did his book on Braddock's defeat a number of years ago really opens the door to what happens here. This is today known as the Jamonville Glen. This is where on that dark, rainy night the French had spent a couple of days encamped down here at the base of these rocks. When Washington and the Half-King's force arrives here, they will instruct Washington to deploy some of his men and Stevens' company across the rock ridge that you see there. Washington would be sweeping in, and he would become attacking from down in this area. The Native Americans would be off over here in some woods in a blocking position to prevent the retreat of the French forces and allowing them to escape back. Now, there's some controversy over who fires the first shot and things, but it matters not. Washington and the Half-King were engaged in an offensive operation. Gunshots are fired. Some of the Native Americans claim that Washington himself fired the first shot as a signal to begin the attack. Washington wrote home to his young brother, Jack, stating that where he was at, where the bullets were flying the thickest, and he wrote, he said, I can tell you there is something charming in the sound. Somehow that line ends up, and the King of England saw that, and he wrote, he made the comment that, well, if he had been used to being around many bullets, he wouldn't think so. So Washington, that line there kind of gives away his naivety. In a nutshell, what happens, the French begin to retreat away from Washington. The Half-King's Indians come out of the woods scouting, driving them back. The French are attempting to surrender to Washington. Commander Jamonville is already wounded. Through an interpreter, he's pleading with George Washington that he's only here on a diplomatic mission, and therefore he must, but before he can begin any communications with Washington, the Half-King rushes up onto the scene and looks at Jamonville and says in French, "Thou art not yet dead, my father," and takes crushes him over the head with his war hammer several times. And then, to the utter horror of the Virginians, he reaches down, grabs his brain, and pulls it out of his skull, and as an onlooking Virginian wrote, it appeared that he washed it in his hands as he crushed it in the gore oozed between his fingers. Washington is going to lose control of the situation. Of course, that terminology assumes that he actually had any real control over the Native Americans at that point to begin with. But before he could get the situation back under control, a dozen of these Frenchmen would be killed and tortured and scalped in that manner. He would quickly round up his captures, the remaining men, about 25 Frenchmen, and they would return back to the Great Meadows and forward those prisoners on to Winchester under a guard of about 20 men. He writes a report to Governor Dinwiddie of the incident, doesn't go into many details, doesn't mention any specifics about what had happened to Jamonville there. But Dinwiddie essentially affirms the mission. These were the French. We were in conflict with them, and he congratulates Washington. Now Washington's going to stay out there, and he's going to start making moves out towards Redstone there in the middle of June. By then, he's been joined by the other half of the Virginia regiment, but unfortunately, his colonel falls off the horse at Wills Creek, hits his head, and dies a couple of days later. So Washington is promoted to colonel. Now, the French quickly get word. They didn't capture everybody, but there was one man who survives this. He had managed to get off into the woods, and the last he had seen was the Indians attacking and moving up towards Washington, and he doesn't see any of the specifics, but he gets back to Fort Necessity and tells the commander there what had happened. Additionally, some of the Indians who were actually with Washington here apparently showed up at the fort, And they told the story the opposite there, that it was Washington's men who had gotten out of control and that they had killed Jumonville with a musket shot to the head. So the French are eager for vengeance. And on June the 26th, as they're marshaling troops for a counter strike against George Washington, he will be reinforced by 100 Indians from Canada and what's now the upper Midwest, under the command of Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, the older brother of Jumonville. Jumonville, although he is not the senior officer, requests command of this expedition due to the barbarities that had been inflicted upon his younger brother. De Villiers' force would have about 600 men combined. Now, Captain Contrecoeur, the senior officer, was very careful to tell him, we must avoid excessive cruelties in here, for our respective kings are at peace. So we're going out here strictly for a limited revenge mission here based on what has already occurred. So this is a map here. I'm sorry I missed this. It shows you the alignment of the troops and how this battle had developed. Now, when he fell back, Washington had constructed Fort Necessity down here, kind of in a bowl. You see the wooded highlands up here in the area. Well, they actually, at the time of the French and Indian War, are much closer to the fort, within musket shot. The Park Service is trying to replant that and regrow those trees so that you can get a better perspective. Most of the fighting would be done by the men in these trenches here and in the stream beds here and there, which they would use for shelter. This is Captain Coulon de Villiers, an experienced officer in the French Marines, and him and his men knew what they needed to do and were experienced fighters. Again, this is going against Washington's ragtag force. Now, by the time de Villiers would arrive at Fort Necessity on the 3rd of June, 1754, Washington is going to be reinforced by a company of South Carolina regulars, garrison troops that had been sent up here, about 100 men under the command of a Captain McKay. Washington, even though he is a colonel appointed by the governor, is really inferior in rank to Captain McKay, who has a royal commission from the king. That will cause some friction, and this rank issue will be a constant thorn in the side of Washington throughout the French and Indian War. But when push comes to shove and the French show up and begin pushing Washington's force back to Fort Necessity, McKay and Washington seem to be working together, and all controversies that had evolved previously over relatively minor issues had disappeared. When this portrait here shows Washington's men beginning to move out. Here's Washington himself. This is McKay and his company moving forward to attack, go out and meet the French. Behind them is the ragtag Virginia Regiment under the command of a Lieutenant Colonel George Muse, who was very dilatory in getting that portion of the regiment out here and had to be reprimanded by Dinwiddie to get him moving. When the French approach Fort Necessity, they're going to come up from more the western, northwest side of the fort there initially, and they're going to fire a long-range volley across the meadow that falls harmlessly. Washington's men are going to deploy out in this vicinity. De Villiers' men are going to move back into the woods and begin coming out. Here's where we get into the picture where Washington's starting to move forward with the South Carolina regulars and under McKay. He's in the lead with them. As they're moving out, though, Muse, who was literally a physical coward, calls out to the men, "Oh, we have to fall back to the fort. They're going to flank us, and they're going to take the fort, and we'll be lost forever." So he begins panicking and sprinting back on his horse to the fort. And of course, these inexperienced Virginians, seeing their commander, are going to do the same. Washington and McKay, seeing the collapse of the Virginia regiment before any real engagement begins, are going to be forced to do likewise and fall back to the trenches. There'll be one small sortie the French and Indians will make towards the fort, but for the most part, they're going to content themselves with ringing the fort and opening fire at short range. Now, Washington has a total of 400 men available. Only about 300 of them are going to be available. Most of them are sick or starving because of lack of supplies. Again, more supplies were supposed to have been brought up to Fort Necessity. However, they do not arrive as George had expected. And so his army is in a bad condition. It kind of turns into a mini siege here.
Hey, we need to...
Many of Washington's men are going to break into the storehouse here and begin the large quantity, drinking some of the large quantities of rum that always seems to have a place in British military operations. And you can imagine it didn't take much when these guys didn't have a lot of food to eat, and then they start drinking the rum. As the day goes on in the late afternoon, there's an immense rainstorm in the middle of the afternoon that comes down. Coulon de Villiers would report that at about 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington's men would open a furious fire there for an hour or two. Now, although it looks like a dire situation, and Washington and his men are thinking about all of these Indians out there with the French and what might befall them if they don't somehow manage to escape the situation. When to their surprise, Coulon de Villiers sends out a man under a flag of truce and says, Parlez-vous, do you want to talk? And Washington at first thinks it's a French ruse, as those dastardly French are often known to do. And then he comes back out again, and so Washington sends out his interpreter. They negotiate a surrender document. One of the key elements of the surrender, without going into many details, is that it acknowledges Washington's responsibility for the assassination of Ensign Jamaica. This will come back to haunt Washington later. The truth of the matter, we can't really historically determine with 100% accuracy what it was, but we know that Washington and his men have this handwritten document, and it's dark. They're reading it around midnight by candlelight and trying to see it. It's got rain droppings on it. Although there's surviving copies of it, and you know, the word assassination is English, French, not too different there, and it's pretty clear there. But one thing that's clear is Washington and his men needed to get the hell out of there alive. And so whether they knew it or not, they signed off on it. They would march out with the honors of war the next day. They had 9 swivel guns with them, with small pieces of artillery. They were allowed to take one with them as part of the honors of war. However, the men were so weak and fatigued from lack of hunger and sickness that there was nobody to carry. All of the horses had been killed and shot by the French during the previous engagement. Washington and McKay would ultimately arrive in Williamsburg, giving an official report to Governor Dinwiddie that would soon be published in the Virginia Gazette. And for the most part, Washington initially was viewed as a man laboring under immense obstacles in his expedition into the Ohio Company. One of the initial blame there was those New Yorkers that got stuck in Alexandria. Never mind that they had significant logistical issues of their own, which is why they didn't get out there. The 400 North Carolinians under Colonel Innes, well, Innes essentially kind of loses control of his command, and most of them scatter and desert and head back to North Carolina. So there really was nobody there to assist Washington when he needed it. Washington would continue as commander of the Virginia Regiment for another couple of months. Dinwiddie, who does not grasp the reality of the situation out there, is calling for an immediate resumption of operations. Let's make another effort to get over there and drive them out before winter sets in. Before long, reality will set in and that will be canceled. As word starts to spread, there will be a lot of criticism of young Washington. The final blow to Washington's ego is going to come when Dinwiddie decides that he's going to let Washington retain the rank of colonel, but all of the companies from the former Virginia regiment are going to be turned into independent companies under the commands of captains. This is too much for Washington's pride to absorb, and he resigns on October 23rd of 1754. Influential people in Virginia write to him and urge him to rethink this and to remain in the service, but Washington refuses to serve under the conditions which he feels have been imposed upon him. But he acknowledges, my inclinations are strong, strongly bent to military arms. Now, wrap this up, I like to close this talk with a quote from Governor Sharp, who, talking to some of the men who had been on the expedition and learning, Governor Sharp is the governor of Maryland and had been an officer in the British Army and would kind of take over senior command at that point. But Sharp would write to Washington and say, I am not insensible of the difficulties you had to encounter. And prophetically he would write, I make no doubt, but your future behavior will soon show the world of the injustice done you by the suspicions they have cast upon you. That success in military arms would be decades away in the American Revolution, but Governor Sharp has certainly seen the promise of young George Washington in 1754.
Does anybody have any questions for Scott?
Yeah. Gentlemen, Bill, where is that actually near? Is that near about an hour and a half outside of Pittsburgh?
Fort Necessity?
John, where the fighting took place?
It's probably about 5-6 miles from Fort Necessity. It's a unit of Fort Necessity National Battlefield. Are you familiar with that location?
Yeah, years ago.
Yeah, you head up 40 from Cumberland before you get to Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And, yeah.
Near Uniontown.
Yes.
And then also, why, if the guy was there to talk as a diplomat, why did Washington let this Native American kill him?
Because Washington was not in control of what they were having there. You know, Washington was going forward with his mission, which, although he had an ally in the Half-King in terms of attacking the French, the Half-King was going forward seeking vengeance of his own. He was not there on a diplomatic mission, nor was Washington, for that matter.
Any other questions?
Roughly, what is the population of the Indians in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, in these?
You know, I don't have an exact number on that, but it's relatively small. One of the numbers I gave you population-wise, there's about 1 million residents in the English colonies along the eastern seaboard of the United States. There's only 75,000 French up there in that immense territory that John showed us earlier. Yeah. But most of those Indians out there were like Shawnee and Delaware, you know, with nominal ties to the Iroquois.
So probably less Indians than French?
No, there would be more Indians than French. Yes. Go ahead in the back.
Yeah, I comment, of course, I wasn't living at that time. But every historian that I've talked to, every book that I've talked to, even the park rangers say that Washington did part of first shot.
Yes, that's what the latest source there from the group of Indians sitting around not too long after that David had found in his research on his Braddock's book that Colonel Innes was sitting around with a couple of the men who were war chiefs. It doesn't specifically identify who they were, but you get the feeling that they had been there, and they identify that Washington himself fired the first gun.
Well, Mr. Miller is being very modest. He was not with Washington during the French and Indian War, but he was with him at the end of the Revolution.
I think he might have been in the whiskey rebellion.
Listen, that's all the time we have for questions right now. Catch Scott during the break. How about another round of applause for John, I think we should make this a a 10-minute break, a little bit shorter break, so hurry back to your seats. I just want to show you a couple of things here. When you get into the back, make sure you grab some of this information. This is information about the work that you're doing. This is reporting on the tourism infrastructure project.